Hello everybody, it's time for another weekly wrap-up, and I'm going to sit here trying so hard not to sneeze for the entire time because my allergies are back, and it's just awful, guys. It's awful, but it's kind of raining this morning and we really need that. So, what I read a lot of children's fiction and a lot of other stuff that I enjoyed, but I don't have much to say about, but I will keep babbling and maybe some of the verbal spew will be interesting. I think it was last week that I mentioned reading Of Mice and Magic by Ursula Vernon, which is the second book in her Hamster Princess series for younger readers. The whole series is about Harriet, who was once invincible because of a fairy curse, and she went off to become a knight. She's no longer invincible, well, kinda, sorta, in cliff diving circumstances, and she really loves hitting things with her sword and saving princesses and all this. She's great at it, and she's actually really intimidating to all the other people. So this past week I caught up with the whole series and I read books 3, 4, and 5, which are Ratpunzel, Giant Trouble, and Whiskerella. All of these books are kind of feminist retellings of fairy tales for a younger audience. If you're older, you can really see some of the twisting and commentary on the original fairy tales. If you're younger, you probably just think that they're good fun. So clearly these are retellings of Rapunzel, Jack and the Beanstalk, and Cinderella. I didn't enjoy Giant Trouble as much as Ratpunzel and Whiskerella because I find Jack and the Beanstalk to be one of the most boring fairy tales ever, and unfortunately that meant part of this book could not be saved for me. But there was also a character in it that's called a harpster. It's a hybrid of a hamster and a harp. Like, it's a hamster with part of its body in the shape of a harp. And this was so creepy. I was really disturbed by this. So I didn't like that very much. But Ratpunzel was great, and Whiskerella I particularly enjoyed because Harriet is saving Whiskerella not from a curse or anything, but from her fairy godmother, because those fairy godmothers want everybody to have a happily ever after, even if it's not what you actually think will make you happy. Annoying. So, you know, Harriet does something about that. So I really enjoyed them, and if you want some light, fun children's fiction, I would recommend them. You may have noticed that I've been rereading a lot of my favorite Discworld novels by Terry Pratchett since the end of 2017, and I think now I have to admit that I am embarking on a massive reread of Discworld. It's not a project, but I'm really in the mood for it now, and one of my goals for the year is to reread books, so if I keep this up, I will definitely achieve that goal. But I continued on with rereading the Moist Von Lipwig books this past week. I finished up Making Money, which is the second one. And this one, Moist has finished rebuilding the postal system. He's actually getting kind of bored. Veterinary spends some time convincing him that he is bored and he should go on to the next challenge, which is tackling the banks in the city. And then Moist does, somewhere in the course of events, he doesn't become the chairman of the bank, but he owns the chairman because that's a dog that has like 51% of the shares in the bank. And the Lavish family, who originally had control of the bank, are targeting him and the dog because if they can eliminate them, they can get control of all that money again. The thing that I noticed in this book, rereading it, is that Moist doesn't spend as much time inventing new things for the banks as he did inventing things for the postal system. And I think that's why I was a little bit disappointed in this book when I first read it, because what I love so much about the Moist books are that he creates things and starts new systems and all of that, and it's great. In this one, he spends more time getting out of sticky situations and navigating the Lavish family and the weird stuff going on behind the bank's doors. He really only invents like 2 things, like paper money, which wasn't that revolutionary because people were already using stamps like paper money, and then he tackles the gold standard, and I won't tell you what he comes up for that because it would ruin the end of the book, and I loved that solution so much. But most of it is him just navigating the politics and the people and everything. So just a little bit of my disappointment comes from the fact that he's not doing exactly the same things that he did in Going Postal, but it was still great. Somewhere along the line, I rated this 5 stars when I imported all my data into Goodreads, and I decided to leave that rating because I still think it is a great book. And then I thought, while I'm in the mood, I will finish my reread of Tiffany Aching on audiobook. So I listened to The Shepherd's Crown, and it is also narrated by Stephen Briggs. This is the final Tiffany Aching book and the final Discworld book, and it was unfinished at the time of Terry Pratchett's death. Despite being unfinished, it is still a complete story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But upon rereading, I noticed more that it wasn't as fleshed out as the previous Tiffany Aching novels. It definitely lacked something in the connective tissue between some of the scenes, and that makes sense since I think there's the afterword that states that Pratchett wrote his books by writing scenes and then connecting them and fleshing them out further. He didn't have the time to do that with the whole book here. The story is that a major character dies. I won't spoil who that is. You probably know if you've read a lot of the Discworld books. And this weakens the defenses of Discworld somewhat. The elves begin invading again, and Tiffany and the other witches have to stop them. And one of the things that comes up is that the elves are invading Discworld, but Discworld has a lot more iron because of the railroads, which was a really interesting touch I hadn't appreciated when I read it the first time. So it was still very good upon rereading, even though I noticed the roughness a bit more. I'm very glad that Discworld ended with this book rather than with Raising Steam, which I remember as being a pretty weak installment. Moving on from my rereads of the week, I then read the Lumberjanes Gotham Academy crossover volume, which has the characters of Lumberjanes meeting the cast of Gotham Academy when they both arrive to rescue their teachers or mentors from what turns out to be like this cursed Sweet 16 birthday party perpetually stuck in 1986. It was a really good story, though I think I ended up rating it only 3 stars because it was rather unmemorable after the fact. I really enjoyed seeing the characters meet and interact because I love the casts of both of these comic series so much. But otherwise, what actually happens in it seemed like a one-off, and I probably won't think about it that much in the future, but I would love to see more crossover issues like this because these characters, they're meant for each other, you know? And then I finished reading The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. This book is nominated in the BookTube SFF Awards in both the fantasy and the debut categories, so I really needed to read it. I loved this book. I wish that I had read it before some of the major hype because I felt this real pressure on me the entire time that, man, it would really suck if I don't enjoy this book as much as everybody else does. Everybody's saying how wonderful it is, and if I don't like it, it'll be awful. But I ended up really enjoying it. The writing was beautiful. The story was so good. I liked the characters. And I really enjoyed the Russian inspiration and the folktales and fairy tales that it uses as inspiration and source material. It was just great. I think this is just a very aesthetically pleasing book, and I feel like that's what the author was going for as well. So I'm not going to recap the plot of it because this book has been so popular. Everybody's read it or is currently reading it for awards and stuff. Somebody told me that the series actually follows the same characters through all the books, which I had thought it wouldn't do because with stories like this that are based on fairy tales, I don't usually find that there's a sequel. Like, fairy tales don't have sequels, so I thought that it would be more of a thematic series, but since it follows the same characters, I really want to know what would happen next in this story, so I'll have to get The Girl in the Tower eventually and continue on. Not right away because I'm trying to stop getting so many library books, but eventually. The last book that I read this past week was An Unkindness of Ghost by Rivers Solomon. This is a science fiction novel. It's also a debut novel, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. The story is set on a generation ship called the Matilda, and the social system inside has devolved into something that mirrors the antebellum South. There are many decks of the ship, and they are labeled with the letters of the alphabet, and the upper decks, like A, B, and C, are where the light-skinned people with privileges and power live, and then the lower decks are where all of the darker-skinned people live, and they are treated like slaves. Our main character is Aster, who is from Q Deck. She does have some more privileges because she is the ship surgeon's protege, which allows her to have passes to go to places on the ship where she usually wouldn't be allowed because of her skin color and her social status. Aster is investigating the cause of these power blackouts that have started happening on the ship again. The same type of blackouts happened like 20-25 years before when her mother was alive and like an engineer on the ship. And Aster thinks there's a connection between what her mother was investigating and her mother's disappearance and these blackouts happening again. I did not expect this book to be so brutal and violent, but it definitely goes there in depicting the horrific conditions of slavery and the constant threats of violence and abuse and rape that all of the characters live with every day. And it is pretty graphic in describing a lot of that. I find it difficult to summarize this book very well because there are so many things going on that are kind of interconnected, but I think that it wasn't super clear what the aim was through much of the book. There are many different things fighting for attention in it. You have the conditions of slavery and the people who are kind of asking Aster to do something about that. And then Aster also trying to investigate what happened to her mother and the blackouts and what's going on with the sovereign of the ship and all of that. It got a bit confusing at times what the most important thing was in this story. As a debut novel, I really appreciated its originality and the ideas it's using and the different kinds of characters that it's playing with, but I feel like the author's vision exceeded their ability to write at this point. I will definitely be following anything else that River Solomon writes, that's for sure. If they can come up with ideas like this, I will be there for them. But I think that that skill with the writing will just come over time as they write more and more things. Maybe I'm being a little too critical. I don't know. Definitely let me know what you think if you've read it. I've heard a lot more people talking about it recently in very glowing terms, so I would agree that it's a great one to pick up. Those are all the things that I read this past week. It was a pretty good week of reading. Now I must go put food in my body because I think it's almost lunchtime and I forgot to eat breakfast. Oops. I'll be back to talk to you again later, and until then, bye.